Hello everyone, I'm Sudha Udaya. Welcome to today's unit in the Building and Construction Programme. Before we begin, I want to remind you of the purpose of this programme. Each unit is designed to give you the knowledge, skills and industry behaviours required to become a competent and confident building practitioner in Australia. Throughout this course, I'll be drawing on more than 30 years of hands-on experience in residential and commercial construction. My goal is to connect the theory directly to real project situations, showing you how the National Construction Code, Victorian regulations, WHS requirements, and industry standards apply on actual work sites. As we move through each topic, think about how these principles translate into the decisions builders and site managers make every day. By the end of each unit, you should feel more prepared to apply these concepts in practical, safe, and compliant ways on the job. Let's get started. Today's session is Module 3, Volume 4, Section 1, Research Project Requirements. In building and construction, tendering is not guesswork. A strong tender comes from strong research. Understanding the project documents, the contract conditions, and the Australian compliance environment that sits behind every project. In this session, we will focus on how to gather the right information from approved project documents, interpret drawings and specifications accurately, apply Australian requirements such as the National Construction Code, NCC, relevant Australian standards and legislation. Consider workforce obligations under the Fair Work Act 2009 and safety duties under WHS laws. Address environmental statutory requirements. Select suitable contract and tender documents, identify risks, and prepare a complete tender submission. By the end, you should feel confident about building a tender package that is complete, compliant, and defensible. Why research matters. Before tendering. Before you price anything, you must understand what you are pricing. Research protects you from underestimating scope and losing margin, missing key compliance requirements and failing inspections, accepting unfair contract terms that shift risk onto the contractor, allowing hidden costs to appear later, preliminaries, access limits, staging, or approvals. In Australia, many disputes come from poor tender research, such as drawing inconsistencies not identified early, specifications that require higher-grade products than assumed, planning conditions or environmental controls that increase costs, contract clauses that restrict extensions of time or variations. Gathering information from project documentation. Tender research starts with collecting the correct documents, current, approved, and complete. Your main sources are approved drawings and drawing register, specifications and schedules, finishes, services, equipment, scope of work, documents and client brief, geotechnical reports and site investigations, planning approvals, permit conditions and authority requirements, any addenda, clarifications or tender questions already issued. This step prevents pricing off outdated drawings or incomplete scope, one of the most common tender mistakes. Drawings and specifications. In construction, drawings and specifications must be read together, not separately. A drawing may show what and where, while specifications define how and with what standard. When reviewing drawings, focus on dimensions, levels, and setouts, coordination between architectural, structural, hydraulic, electrical, and civil. Areas that commonly clash: services, penetrations, ceiling spaces, plant rooms, constructability constraints, access, staging, temporary works, needs. When reviewing specifications, focus on material quality levels and product requirements, workmanship expectations and tolerances, testing, commissioning, inspection and certification requirements. Substitution rules, whether alternatives are allowed or restricted. Your tender research should highlight mismatches, missing details, and unclear items early, so your pricing is realistic and your risk is controlled. National Construction Code. The National Construction Code, NCC, influences design and construction obligations across Australia. Even if the designer is primarily responsible for design compliance, the builder must understand how NCC requirements affect construction methods and materials, fire safety and egress pathways, structural and weatherproofing requirements, energy efficiency and condensation management expectations, accessibility and amenity provisions where applicable. In tender research, NCC awareness helps you identify cost impacts such as fire-rated systems and certification requirements, upgraded glazing, insulation, ceiling or ventilation requirements, accessibility features, ramps, signage, compliant fixtures, documentation needs, product certificates, test reports, installation evidence. A good tender includes allowances for the compliance pathway and inspection needs. If you ignore NCC impacts during tendering, you usually pay for them later without being paid for them. Industry standards, legislation and regulations. Project requirements also sit within a wider Australian framework of Australian Standards, AS, referenced by specs, consultants and contracts. State or territory building legislation and regulations. Local council requirements and planning conditions, contract law principles and tender rules. In practice, you will often see standards linked to concrete and structural requirements, timber framing, waterproofing and finishes, electrical and plumbing requirements through licensed trades and codes, quality and testing expectations. Your role during tender research is not to memorize every standard, but to identify which standards are referenced in the specification. Confirm the compliance tasks that create cost, testing, inspections, certification. Ensure subcontractors can meet those standards and provide evidence. This is how you turn compliance into planned work, not last-minute rework. Fair Work Act and workforce considerations. Tender research must also consider workforce obligations under Australian workplace laws, including the Fair Work Act 2009. Labour costs are not only wage rates, they include lawful employment conditions and site obligations. In tender planning, this affects correct engagement of workers, employee versus contractor arrangements, allowances that apply through awards or enterprise agreements, working hours, overtime patterns and penalty conditions, labour availability in the market, and realistic productivity assumptions. A practical tender approach includes checking whether the project has site-specific industrial requirements, planning labour resourcing so you don't rely on unrealistic overtime, confirming subcontractors are legitimate and compliant operators, building payroll and supervision needs into preliminaries. WHS duties in tender preparation. Under WHS laws across Australia, businesses have duties to manage risks so far as is reasonably practicable. Tender research should identify WHS impacts early, because safety requirements affect cost, program, and methodology. During tender review, consider site access constraints, traffic management and public interface risks, working at heights, excavation, lifting, and temporary works requirements, hazardous materials risks, dust, silica controls or demolition hazards, contractor and subcontractor management requirements, inductions, supervision, PPE, permits, site amenities and compliance needs, fencing, signage, site security, emergency planning. Environmental statutory requirements. Environmental requirements come from multiple levels in Australia, including planning permit conditions and council requirements, state environment protection rules and EPA expectations, project-specific environmental management conditions, waste disposal requirements and regulated material handling. Tender research should identify environmental controls that affect cost and program, such as sediment and erosion control measures, dust and noise management requirements, waste sorting, recycling targets and disposal fees, protection of trees, waterways, or neighbouring property. Spill prevention, storage requirements, and emergency response needs. Environmental compliance is also reputational. Poor environmental controls lead to complaints, stop work pressure, and damaged client confidence. Selecting appropriate contracts and tender documents. Tender research includes selecting the right contract and tender documents for the project type and risk profile. In Australia, contract forms may vary. Some are standardized, some are heavily customized by clients. Key checks include contract type and risk allocation, who carries delays, design responsibility, latent conditions, scope definition, how variations are treated and approved, time provisions, extensions of time and liquidated damages conditions, payment provisions, progress claims, retention, security and evidence requirements, insurance requirements, types and minimum coverage levels, defects and warranties, defects, liability periods and response requirements. Identifying risks during contract review. As you evaluate contracts and tender documents, you should identify and record risks immediately. Typical tender stage risks include ambiguous scope or missing design information, tight time frames with high liquidated damages exposure, unclear variation rules or restrictive approval processes, client-controlled items that could delay work, late decisions or delayed access, long lead items with supply volatility, complex staging, limited site access or high public interface risks, environmental and permit conditions that restrict work hours or methods. Documenting risks and building a risk register. Once risks are identified, they must be documented clearly. Many businesses use a simple risk register during tendering. Tender risk documentation also supports management review and approval, clear tender qualifications that protect the business. Better handover to the project team if you win the job. If risk isn't written down, it is often forgotten. Then it becomes a surprise during delivery. A recorded risk becomes a managed risk. Preparing tender documentation. Preparing tender documentation means packaging your offer so the client can evaluate it clearly and fairly. A good tender submission typically includes completed tender forms and schedules, pricing breakdown aligned to scope requirements, proposed methodology and program assumptions where required, preliminary costs and time-related cost allowances, subcontractor and supplier information where requested, compliance statements, WHS, environmental quality approach if required, tender qualifications and clarifications written professionally. A complete tender package reduces questions, reduces dispute risk, and improves your credibility as a contractor. Attaching supporting documentation. Supporting documentation strengthens your tender and proves capability. Common supporting attachments include key drawings or drawing lists referenced in your pricing, specifications or schedule references as required, construction methodology notes if requested, company capability statements and relevant project experience, safety management approach or WHS documentation summaries where required, environmental management approach where relevant insurances and licenses, evidence if required at tender stage. For visual communication, some clients also request construction drawings as referenced, an artist's impression or presentation imagery where applicable. The main rule is relevance. Include only what the client asked for and ensure it matches the tender conditions. Required submission schedules. Many tenders require specific schedules to be completed accurately. These commonly include preliminary services such as site establishment, supervision, safety controls, and temporary works. Plant and equipment, including what you will supply or hire. Pre-qualification evidence showing capability, experience, and compliance systems. Lists of proposed subcontractors and key specialist trades. Personnel details or management approaches where required. Accuracy is critical because these schedules often form part of the contract. Commitments made at tender stage may be enforced later. Client acceptance forms and special conditions. Some tender packages require client acceptance forms, acknowledgement of addenda, and proposed amendments or special conditions. This is where you clearly state your tender price and validity period, any clarifications, exclusions, or assumptions, any proposed contract amendments only if permitted, any conditions that affect delivery, such as access dates, approvals, or client-supplied items. This step must be handled professionally. The goal is to protect the business while still presenting a cooperative and credible tender. Final evaluation, approval, and submission. Before submission, complete a final evaluation of the tender documentation to confirm it is complete, no missing schedules, signatures, or attachments, consistent, price matches, scope and assumptions, compliant, meets tender rules and formatting requirements, reviewed, risks identified and addressed appropriately. Many businesses require internal approval or endorsement before submission, especially for high-value tenders, high-risk contracts, tight timeframes, or high liquidated damages exposure. A tender is a legal offer. Accurate records protect the business if questions or disputes arise later. Completing the client contract after award. If you win the project, the tender often becomes the base for the client contract. At this stage, it's essential to confirm the final scope and contract documents list, ensure all negotiated changes are captured in writing, confirm insurances, licenses, and compliance documentation. Finalize key subcontractor engagement in line with your tender assumptions. Prepare for handover from estimating to project delivery. This is also the moment to ensure the project team understands tender clarifications and qualifications, key risks and planned controls, compliance requirements, WHS, NCC, and environmental obligations. A strong tender-to-contract transition protects margin, reduces misunderstandings, and supports a smoother project start. To summarize research project requirements, we covered how to build a strong foundation for tender preparation by gathering information from approved plans, specifications, and documentation, interpreting drawings and specifications to confirm the true scope, considering Australian compliance requirements, including NCC, standards, WHS, Fair Work, and environmental obligations, selecting appropriate contract and tender documents and identifying key risks, documenting risks clearly in a practical risk register, preparing tender documentation, completing submission schedules and attaching supporting evidence, finalizing approvals, completing evaluations and submitting correctly, transitioning smoothly from tender to contract with clear document control. If you apply these steps consistently, your tenders become more accurate, more compliant, and far less risky to deliver. Don't forget, our LMS contains interactive learning video series. Please watch them as part of your study and link them to today's session. To support your study, we've introduced the AI Playbook. This tool simulates assessment questions and provides guidance. You can access it from your assessments. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Sudha Udaya, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.